Okay, great. So some people have indicated that they can hear us loud and clear, which is wonderful. So I just want to say a very big welcome to everyone who has joined us online this afternoon for our webinar, and a very special thanks obviously to Dr. Helen McAneney for agreeing to deliver this very interesting webinar. So firstly, I'll just give a bit of background into yourself, Helen, if that's okay for everyone that's joined us, and then I can pass over to yourself to deliver the webinar. And as I mentioned, people feel free to pop in some questions using the Q&A facility at the right-hand side of your screen, or even the chat facility. I'll be moderating both throughout the session, and I will pose the questions then to Helen at the end, and we can engage in some discussion around that. That suits everybody. Okay, so just to get started, Dr. Helen McAneney is a lecturer in research methodology in the Northern Ireland Hub for Trials Methodology Research at the Centre for Public Health at Queen's University Belfast. Helen holds a degree in mathematics and also a PhD in theoretical physics, and Helen has applied her mathematical skills of network science and modelling to public health and health more broadly. Her current research includes work in public health, education and food chains, investigating the effects of the often hidden or unknown knowns of social networks in health and behavioural choices in projects such as the PARC study, HAL trial, and the shared education or contested space programmes. She is involved in an ESRC-funded Transforming Social Science Smartphone study to investigate the ethical and research implications of using smartphones to capture data, various aspects of the recruitment and retention of trial participants, and also with SWOTs, or studies within a trial. So Helen, I'm going to pass over the controls to you now, and you can go through your presentation. And as I mentioned earlier, participants, please feel free to type questions as we go, and I'll pitch these to Helen at the very end. Okay, Helen? Okay, thank you very much, Sandra. And first of all, thank you for having me here today and for the invitation to present for this, my very first webinar. And also thank you to all the listeners for joining in today to hear me speak. So as Sandra said, I'm a lecturer in research methodology at Queen's University Belfast, and today's talk is about networks within trials and to consider, are these a blessing or are they a burden? So I will start off by giving a brief introduction and some background to what networks are, what I term networks to be. Then I will go into the PAL scheme, where we find networks where we didn't expect them, and then to go on and consider networks and trials. So to begin with, what are networks? Well, we often think of social networks as being the social media of Facebook and Twitter, but they can be much, much more. It's how we interact with our friends, how we interact with our family, and even our work colleagues, as well as, of course, how we also sit within our organisations, maybe the environments in which we work in, as well as maybe being the membership of certain clubs or societies. And indeed, here we are today in the Trials Methodology Research Network webinar. So we are all connected through membership of that. To put it in more concrete terms, Mark Newman in Physics Today in 2008 produced a lovely article describing nodes, which are the dots in network graphs, and the edges, which are the lines, that in its simplest way is just a collection of points joined by lines. But it's what we define these points to be and the connections, these lines, that are of interest, because we can, through statistical analysis, get clues about how they function and maybe predict future behaviour. But it could be computers, it could be animals, or indeed people. The only small bit of math I'm going to present today, the notation for networks are that we have circular dots representing A, B, and C here, and the data is contained within what's known as adjacency matrix. And it simply is the information of where is there a line from one node to another node. So for instance, here we have a connection from node C to node B, and here we have a connection from node A to node C. So that is really all the additional information we know, but it's how we then use this. And
we use it by figuring out what do they actually represent. So networks, two lovely pieces of work by Douglas Luke from the public health perspective, that network analysis is an approach that research that is uniquely suited to describing, exploring and understanding the structural and relational aspects of health. And he provided a great overview of many different aspects in that. But also, networks can be thought of in terms of the social sciences, and Stephen Bergetti produced an article in Science in 2009 with this table, which shows you what many of those lines can represent. It can be that we are due to a similarity of location. It can be that we have an attribute such as the same attitude to something that could connect us. It can be that we have some social relationship, that we're a friend of someone, or indeed it can be more formal and hierarchical, such as being the boss of someone. But what's very interesting is often the interactions that can form, in particular who we talk to or maybe receive advice from, or who we even source our help from. And it's these interactions that I think are the most interesting. As well, of course, there is just certain flows of resources as well and how we use these to optimal effect. And from this, we have the term social epidemiology has now been coined, or we're looking into the social epidemiology now, where social network analysis involves the characterization of the social networks, but yields these inferences of who may be exposed to risk. We can think of it in terms of social contagion and also how the social interactions around us influence our own individual health as well as the population health as a whole. So I've given you a bit of a background, but why do we need to consider it? Why do we need to bother? Well, I believe that we're all embedded within a social network. As I say, we are embedded within our friends, family and work colleagues, and this does indeed influence our own behaviour choices and health choices that we make, and this needs to be considered. And the reason why we need to consider it, I love this diagram, because individually, each one of these lines represents the flight path of a plane. Individually, you would not know much, but collectively, sometimes patterns can emerge. And indeed, this is the shape of the United States, purely from flight data, where we can start to see the different hubs, airports, the city structures taking place. So through the collective knowledge, we can start to see the whole picture. And that's in terms of systems thinking, but network analysis is also part of systems thinking as well. And to just go through the sort of background in terms of some areas that networks have already been used in, often we think of the transmission of diseases or the diffusion and the spread of information or innovations. The most recent one in history, I suppose, is the Apple, the iPhone, and how that has spread amongst networks. We also have very much the thinking of how social networks can affect our health behaviours and how smoking and obesity and other aspects like that may spread through our networks. We can be influenced by what we perceive as the normal behaviours around us. And of course, there's more, there'll be more sort of traditional ways of looking at networks, the networks of the citation of articles, how we co-cite articles, both from the past citations to the future citations. But to get on to some research then, is this, I wanted to particularly show you this piece of work, which is to do with the PAL scheme, because this is somewhere where we had networks where we were not expecting them, and you might find this also true in your own work. So this is called the hidden networks within a behaviour change intervention. Hidden because we didn't realise we weren't specifically looking for them in the first place, and also because they're always there in the background. And if you want more information, the publication details are below. Of course, I can't go without giving the acknowledgement of the funding and also of the fellow Ruth Hunter, Frankie and others who are involved in this. So the background to the PAL scheme, or the Physical Activity Loyalty, is that participants were given a loyalty card, which when they were going and walking in their office, this was to do with a workplace intervention where we were trying to get the people more physically active during their working hours, so be it at the lunch break or at other times during the day that they would go out and participate in walking. There were strategically placed stations along the pathways, there were 5 in total, that they could swipe their card and that would then be recorded that they had passed that point at a particular time. The more places you passed, the more points you got. The more points you got rewards. So it was to see the benefit of rewards. However, what we found was that during this, the timestamp data of almost 20,000 timestamps from people walking past these strategically placed positions, which were accurate to the second, but also included the personal ID of the user. We noticed that a number of people were on the same day at the same location and say within 15 seconds of each other passing a location, and the same 2 people were at point A, then at point B together, then at point C together. So we could infer that there was some sort of social proximity within there, and so there was a social component to their physical activity. Being at 3 or more locations together within a very short time, it was inferred therefore that they were walking together, so there was a social aspect to the physical activity. And this is the overall aggregated data that we found, in that there was, over the 12-week period, this is all 12 weeks, where we have a number of people, 406 to be precise, and the blue indicates male, red indicates female, and the size of the node has an indication of their BMI. So we're seeing that of the 406 people involved in the intervention, 225 were actually in communal physical activity. That is, they were walking with someone else. Mostly people were walking in 2s or 3s, but there was one group over the whole intervention that there was quite a interchange of who they were walking with. If you then start to look at it as it progressed, we see that in week 1 we had 176 social ties, and the social tie had a strength of 6. That means that people were often walking past about 6 locations together on average. By week 6, we had fewer ties, we had only 138, but of those social ties, they were walking longer, on average 7.4. And by the end of the intervention, at week 12, again, fewer social ties, but they're still maintaining a distance of about almost or just over 7 placing locations together. So in terms of this, yes, there is social engagement and communal activity together, but even though the communal activity decreased over the actual intervention period, we've seen that those who were walking with others were actually going a further distance. To say the number of receivers swiped that passed, which is an indication of distance, initially increased to 7 and stabilized at around 7. So although fewer people are walking, those that are walking have walked a further distance, which is something that if you purely looked at each individual on their own in isolation, you may not have seen. So the thoughts for the future on that piece is that, is there a social aspect to interactions and interventions? And should we actually, rather than considering people as individuals in isolation, think of them more as group activities and to consider the possible as value and benefit to these interventions? And indeed, as put by this article, social networks, social media and social disease, that social processes underpin everything in our lifestyle, our health decisions, the way healthcare is conceived and delivered, and that includes and leads me on to consider trials. Is it a blessing? Is it a burden? Is it a bit of both? It's something to consider, and what I'm presenting here are my thoughts on the matter, and probably more questions than answers, unfortunately, but hopefully will give you some food for thought for the future in your own work. So are we actually individuals, or are we networks of individuals, particularly in the context of trials? So we have the nodes, which are often the people, and the networks, how they work together. So first off, to consider the patients and the participants in a trial. We often assume that they are isolates, that they are individuals, entities, but they are a collective group. Could they be a source of information? Could they recruit others? Equally, could there be the sharing of tales, good and bad, amongst them? So it's something to consider. The trial team themselves, those who deliver the trial and those who are maybe constructing the trial, they are a group of people. A trial is very difficult and never done by one single person. So how, as much as they're facilitating the trial, how they interact and communicate with participants and amongst themselves, could that have a bearing on how the trial process progresses? And as I say, there's the researchers and those who, the chief investigator and those who are constructing the notion of why a trial needs to be involved behind. And then the process of how you actually develop the trial. Who is it you're collaborating with? Who is it you're sourcing your ideas from? Who is it that the methodological approach is coming from? These are all, again, forming networks. So how on earth are these affecting how the trial progresses? And then the main one, of course, the trial itself. Very much we often think of networks to disseminate our findings, maybe a way of beyond academia to stakeholders and patient groups. But is there a way of using networks and how they're constructed to design or to have an alternative approach to your trial? So I want to look at some of these in a little bit more detail now. So in terms of patients and participants to a trial, there are good points and bad points, and that's why it's blessing or burden. When we're trying to source people for a trial, can we use patients' own networks that we already have to source others? For instance, if it's a really hard to reach group or very rare disease, could they already know through the actual patient groups, other people or other family members who already have similar conditions? Of course, you still need to apply the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and also we have to be aware that we want a representative sample within the trial, and we have to be aware of potential biases if we're recruiting a particular style of people or from a particular location. But it could be a way of actually utilising the patient's information that they already have to actually gain more people in the trial and possibly retain in the trial as well. Of course, there is the way the patients work together. They can have social support for themselves, so in terms of answering their questions and sharing experiences, and this may help manage their disease or manage if it's a particular patient group that you're working with. The flip to that then, of course, is you're not in control of what they're maybe sharing and their experiences they're sharing. So could they be telling misinformation or sharing tales of woe or even tainting a message, passing on, but not in quite the way you initially intended? Also, when people are waiting for it, waiting to be seen, can patients interact and talk? Is there potential contamination? Oh, I felt really bad today and I had the blue tablet last week. possibilities that we just need to consider, as well as others that are unknown interactions that are happening behind the scenes with family and friends. So really, is the patient group, it is a group of people, so do we need to think of them as a network of people and rather than just individuals that we are using within our trial? Secondly, as I mentioned, there's a team that actually puts together the trial. We frequently do it over multiple sites because there is benefit of a large number of participants so that we can achieve our sample size. Many locations mean that we reduce the notion of localized findings, a wider range of population groups, and the ability to compare results among centres. This all increases the generalizability of the study, which is what we want. But is there a downside to that? Within trials, here's a schematic I made that we have in a multi-centre trial. At the core, we have the trial. Then the next layer out, we have the multiple centres. Here I've depicted 4, A, B, C, and D. At each centre, then you would have the trialists, and they in turn are interacting with their particular patient or participant groups. So they're wanting to recruit and also retain them in the trial. However, each centre involves different trialists, and how those trialists then interact with their participants. Does that matter? Because we often, I'm going to pose the question, because we often see that recruitment and retention differ from one site to another. And what makes these sites different? Could it be that it is the characteristics of the trial team, how the trial team is managed at each localized site through, is it a hierarchical structure? Is it a more formalized structure where only certain people interact with patients? How the team communicate together and how they then seem to interact with the participant group? Do these factors matter, and is that what causes the difference? It may not, but it is something worth considering. Do these social interactive aspects of the team matter? So thirdly, as I mentioned, we have the researchers, and indeed we are always in terms of social networks together. In terms of the HRB Trials Methodology Research Network, we're all members, and there's a list of experts and certain expertise that people have. In the UK, we then have the Hub for Trials Methodology Research, and within that we have the working groups, which are again bringing certain people together and how they then interact and determine information can be influenced by these networks. Posing more questions, does the past influence the future on who we collaborate with? How we have worked with one group? Since we've worked with them in the past, do we automatically work with them in the future rather than exploring new collaborations? And then just to go ahead and to consider the actual trial itself. So in terms of the actual trial, we often think of networks to disseminate our information through, and that certainly is possible. Particularly in terms of social media, we often use Twitter. This webinar is being promoted extensively through Twitter, and we can see then through maybe retweets how the reach of the actual information is passed on. However, there's another possibility. Can we actually see if the participants can use it to spread the findings? Could we use it to monitor how participants actually understand the trial? And in particular, I point out just this work by Daniel Scanfield on the dissemination of health information through social networks. And what he was looking at was how the word antibiotic was being used. And if I bring it up now, here is just a word cloud of certain words that were often associated with antibiotics in Twitter. What it can be useful for is to see, is there good information being passed on? Do people associate maybe instead of using the word antibiotics, you could have your trial name. And when that is featured, are the comments always good? Are they bad? Are they picking up the main points that your trial actually is about? So all of that can come into it as well. So we can use it both to disseminate our information, but also monitor how that information is being spread and being spread correctly. As mentioned earlier, participants are also within networks, so can we use them and their networks to spread our findings even further rather than through our traditional academic networks? And that's also something worth considering. Of course then, can we use these social interactions of our participants to enhance the trial, possibly to reinforce behaviour, peer support, peer groups? Can we influence behaviour? And indeed, this was an experiment carried out on the creation of a group of people with similar traits so that they would indeed have a better outcome at the end of an intervention. Now, lastly, another way that networks could be used in the background of a trial is if you maybe have limited resources, particularly if you're wanting to do an interview. But rather than interviewing all 30 experts in the UK, you only have the time and resources to interview 5. So how do you indicate which 5 you should interview? Well, a possibility, and one that I had outlined in this publication, is the use of networks where we survey all 30 of the people involved and see who do they interact with most frequently, or who do you think is the opinion leader in your group. And through that, you can then find out who is nominated the most, and that, hopefully, would then be the 5 people that you should interview. Or you may find that you have very distinct groups that are not interconnected, and therefore you might need to source 2 people from one group and 3 from another group, so that both groups are covered. Be it that you have the Scottish are speaking to the Scottish, the English are speaking to the English, but they're not interacting together. Just as an example. So where next with all of this? Well, one possibility is, as mentioned, I'm involved in the SWOT studies within a trial, and there's a link to more information should you require. Should we possibly look at these aspects within trials on how that is affecting trials? Should we see, does it matter? Should we actually do some additional data collection and collect who is interacting with whom, or who is resourcing, sharing of the resources amongst each other? So really a lot of questions with maybe not too many answers today, but hopefully through this I've made you think a little bit about what is possible and whether or not you need to actually consider it. So last slide, I believe, is thank you for listening, and hopefully I hope that networks can be a blessing within trials, but there are caveats that we do need to consider. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Helen. That was really interesting. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So what I do is I just kind of call to the panelists or to the attendees there that are listening in if they'd like to ask you a question, Helen, if they have any comments that they'd like to raise. You can do so using the Q&A facility or the chat facility, and I'll keep an eye on things as they come in, and I can pose them to you. I suppose, Helen, I mean, it's great obviously that you mentioned the researchers networks, because we're promoting that all the time between the HRB-TMRN and the MRC-HTMR. And although I'm probably biased, I think they have had a very beneficial effect for researchers involved in this space. I suppose talking about looking at your trial and identifying networks of your participants within your trial, is there a way that, I mean, should you kind of look a bit outside the box a bit when you're trying to identify your network? And how difficult can it be to identify networks within with their participants in a trial? Is there kind of, I suppose, tips for identifying which networks people kind of circulate in, or is there kind of how much effort should you put into that? Or have you any guidance around that for people who might be listening?
Thinking firstly, what always comes to mind, and I'm sure comes to other people's minds, is the groups or the support networks that might already be there for a specific disease, and who is exactly involved with that. So that could be an already populated list that would be useful for recruitment purposes. But another could be that simply when you already are starting recruitment, that you ask people to pass on information to, or to nominate names that they think might be a potential participant to the trial. You would, of course, need to vet them and to still pass the inclusion-exclusion criteria, of course. And but I think you can tap into the participants' own knowledge. It's knowledge that we don't often use, and particularly in the island of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, we know everyone. Your aunties, mothers, wives, cousins, oh, they also have that. So why not use that to our benefit?
Exactly.
So I think that's a possibility. In terms of normally in networks, we like it bounded, we like it pretty closed form. But for recruitment for trials, I think it's good to open it up as far as possible so that you do achieve your sample numbers that you're after. And it may be a way to look beyond the normal way of recruiting.
And I noticed there at the start you had some nice, visuals of kind of networks that you noticed throughout time. Was that an exercise study again that you presented? And it was looking at people who were together, were walking for longer. Was that am I right in saying that? Yeah. And I was just thinking about the data and how you could collect that. And I know you have an interest as well in smartphones for gathering data and apps. Is there anything are there any good examples of maybe using something like a smartphone to help capture more information about an existing network that you mightn't be aware of?
Certainly, in the study I was involved in, we produced an actual app. Rather than the traditional way of collecting data on pen and paper, we collected the information on pen and paper, but also using an app with the people to see, is the information similar? Does it change over time? And get the same sort of information through the app. And it does seem promising. You do kind of we all have our phones with us all the time, but there is a balance to be had within sort of your personal space and when you're actually asked to produce, sit down, fill out a questionnaire, you're willing to do it. Sometimes if the phone app were to ask too frequently, you might go, no, this is my own space, this is my own time, I don't want to use it. So there's a balance between the traditional way of collecting data and the new way through smartphone apps that's still being teased out. To use an app to collect data, you still need to source the people first.
Exactly, yeah.
That can be the difficulty. The one that we specifically used, it was 16 to 18-year-olds, so it was in a school environment, so we captured them by being in a specific school, so that helped. But certainly the use of apps, and we all have the health apps on our phones, they are there, and it is a growing aspect that we do need to consider.
Great. So we just have a question here from Sean Treweek. He wants to know, with regards to recruitment and retention at sites, how do you think we should modify feasibility studies to recognise the importance of social networks to recruitment and retention at those sites?
Ooh. In terms of feasibility studies, you're often trying to actually undertake what you're hoping will be the full trial and to see how feasible it is. So you're trying to make it as realistic as possible. So to include, I would want to therefore include the network analysis at that feasibility stage, be it to collect the data on who is involved, who is interacting with whom, even just the formal hierarchical structure, so that you could actually see at multiple sites, is this an important factor? Is it how people are working together? Is it who is it that is approaching the participants? At what level are they? Is it someone very senior, or is it more someone with a better listening ear? So I would try to be bringing as realistic a component in at the feasibility stage as you would want in the main trial, so as to see, does this matter?
Because when you think of it, there could be a lot of interactions, and sometimes there can be unexpected interactions. For example, if a trial, if somebody is away, if somebody's filling in, and it's kind of difficult to account for all of them. But certainly, as you say, you could look at even the level of the person and how they're interacting with, say, the patients that are being recruited, or try and have a sense of that overall of it at the different sites before you progress.
And even monitor it over time, as well as levels over time. And as you said, somebody is unexpectedly away for 2-week holiday. Was there a dip in that 2 weeks, or did it alter? And what changed that could maybe affect that? Of course, there's always the background noise. There are different people that you are working with, but could there be an effect? And that will be interesting to see.
Yeah, great. And just one other question that's come in there as well. Do you think the network analysis at sites could be generalized to future sites, the method, even if what you find is specific to the site?
So if you're able to actually find out that a certain style of management works better, be it a more informal structure, then it's something you could maybe recommend at future sites. You could certainly test it to see if recruitment is particularly low at a site. You might consider then altering it to a different management style, and to see would that pick up recruitment. So it could possibly be used for future implications. But it would be all whether there's something there in the first place or not. That would be the interesting thing to find out.
Great. Great. So I don't think there's any more questions from our attendees. I'm just going to do one last check. If anyone wants to type in a burning question for Helen, I can pose it to her before she finishes up. I suppose, have you ever come across a kind of an example of a network that really surprised you, or any studies whereby doing this kind of threw back something that they really weren't expecting, or is it still, I suppose, at such an early stage that maybe that has to come yet, where we're kind of exploring very new and unusual networks?
Certainly, the example I gave in the PAL study, our intention was simply to promote behaviour through the loyalty scheme, and the timestamp data was collected to provide the loyalty points. So we weren't anticipating that those network structures would be there, but it was a way that we were unobtrusively able to actually find out that it was there. So it did surprise us in that instance, but I think as we become more and more aware of how we are working together and interacting together, that it is an aspect we maybe need to consider more often. Hopefully we won't be surprised, because we will actually be thinking in the bigger picture and bigger way.
Great. Thanks very much, Helen. And I suppose just to wrap up, I should mention the importance of networks. Not only here in Ireland with the HRB Trials Methodology Research Network, but for anyone listening in, there are 4 new I suppose disease or topic specific networks that were recently funded and are now up and running, funded by the HRB. There's a stroke network, a primary care network, a critical care network, and a mother and baby network, and all the information for those can be found either through our website or through the HRB Clinical Research Coordination Ireland network, which is another HRB funded network. So it's great to see in the last few years that there's been some heavy investment with regards to networks to support researchers here in Ireland. So I just wanted to flag that to everybody who's listening. So I think that's it for our questions to Helen. As I said, the recording of this webinar will be available this afternoon on the website, and I will send everyone the link as well to keep them updated. They may want to kind of have a listen back on some of the findings that Helen shared with us. And just to also highlight that our next webinar is not until September, so we're winding down a little bit for the summer. It's the 20th of September, again at 12 noon. This will be delivered by Caroline Hurley, who is HRB-TMRN PhD student in UCC, and this will be on risk-based monitoring and the introduction of the new ICH-GCP guidelines. So on that note, Helen, a very sincere thank you once again for delivering today's webinar and for engaging in the discussion with us. It was really insightful. So thanks for your time, and thanks to everyone for joining us online as well.
Thank you.